because obviously the big problem here, and you sort of discussed this earlier with, I think a lot of people could probably get their head around how you could match a 9mm bullet to a specific kind of gun, and a Glock 19 or something, because it has the right number of lands and grooves for the rifling, right, and the twist rate, and the general idea that you could see something that matches that specific kind of firearm. But how do they explain getting from a Glock 19, where there's just as a general gun that probably fired this bullet, to this specific Glock 19,
right,
out of the millions that have been made and sold throughout the world? How do they claim that they can do that?
So that's where this gets really, really interesting. So, even on an assembly line, making the exact same product hundreds and hundreds of times over the course of a day, at some level, right? If you keep zooming in, at some level, those products are going to be different, right? Because no two things are exactly the same at the molecular level. And so what the theory is that when you manufacture a gun, when the lands and grooves are cut into the gun, the machine that does the cutting leaves imperfections in the lands and grooves, tiny, tiny imperfections. And every gun is going to be different on this very microscopic level. And every time that gun fires a bullet, it goes through the grooves, and these tiny little imperfections put little scratches on it as it goes through that you can only see through a microscope. And every gun leaves unique scratches that can be traced to that specific gun. Now, I think that this is pretty far-fetched for some reasons I'll get into later, but I want to address your testing question first.
So what would let's say, so that's the theory, and we'll get into some of the issues with it, but you're saying they've come up with their own tests for it, but they're substandard. What would be a good test, I guess? And has anyone developed it and tried it out?
So they move beyond these Group A, Group B tests, and then so at this particular trial, it comes out that the state's expert, who's a forensic firearms analyst, he has his own test that he's given people over the years, and a group of public defenders in New York got a copy of that test, and they gave it to a half dozen attorneys in their office, attorneys who had no firearms training whatsoever, forensic firearms training, were not experts, just defense attorneys, and they all passed it with flying colors. Now, if the whole point of these tests is to sort of validate the unique expertise that firearms analysts bring to a trial that juries need to be told about, the fact that these defense attorneys who do not have that expertise, do not have that training, were able to ace this test is a pretty good indication that this test is not evidence of that expertise, right?
So what would be, I guess? So
the ideal test, and I want to talk about these two Ames tests that were given, but let me tell you what the ideal test would look like. The ideal test would be an effort to measure proficiency at these analysts as they do their day-to-day jobs, as they perform day in and day out. And so we do have one lab that has done this, and that's the Houston Forensic Science Center, which is a crime lab that was started after a number of scandals. The idea was to, we're going to create the first crime lab that is run, strictly along sort of scientific principles. And so the guy that runs that lab, Peter Stout, has made that commitment. And so one of the things he does is over the course of the workday, probably not every day, but at any given time, one of his analysts could get a fake case, right? And this is to test their ability and test their proficiency. And the idea is they don't know when they're being tested. And so he masks the test. And in fact, he gives Starbucks gift cards to any analyst who can sniff out one of the test cases, because he wants them to blend in, right? He wants them. And so what he found with his firearms analyst is that when it comes to determining whether two bullets were fired by the same gun, which is one type of test, or two bullets were fired by a different gun, the error rate, I'm going to make sure I remember these, somewhere between 10 and about 40% among his analysts.
That's a pretty wide area, right?
That's a pretty big margin. I mean, if you're talking about sending someone to prison or death row, I mean, I think you will probably want an error rate well below 1%, right? And, to his credit, he released the results of this, and he doesn't let his analysts testify to anything that he doesn't think is grounded in science. So they're not allowed to match one bullet to one gun in trial. They can give broader testimony about, I can't exclude this gun, but he won't let them because, he found that they're just not accurate enough. And it's not a reflection on, it's not that they're bad analysts compared to other analysts in the field. It's just that, this, I think, the problem with giving people these tests, these proficiency tests outside the laboratory is that people are going to change the way they take these tests when they know they're being tested. They're not going to take the test the same way that they perform their jobs. And we want to know how well they perform their jobs because that's what we're going to use to determine whether or not this type of evidence is reliable and predictable. And so what he found was that it's not. And, this is also a lab that presumably, because of his sort of commitment to science, is probably hiring the most conscientious analysts he can. So these are probably some of the best firearms analysts out there, and this is their margin for error. So I don't think it's a test, I don't think it speaks to the quality of the people working in that lab. I think it speaks to the fact that this field in general has a very high margin for error, and that's something that we need to reckon with.
Right. I mean, I think to somebody, honestly, even to a layperson, the problems with this sort of pattern matching for firearms seem fairly obvious, right? I mean, I understand the basic idea that even though a mass-produced gun would still have some slight variations to it compared to, the one manufactured 10 down the line. But it does start to seem very difficult to me to have some really specific level, really competent level of certainty that you can match a mass-produced gun with a single bullet that was fired from it that is also a mass-produced product. The ammunition itself is mass-produced, right, as well. And even if let's say there are some slight imperfections in the rifling of every gun, presumably that would also change over time too, right? This is another issue that seems fairly straightforward, that the imperfections that are put in by use of the firearm are going to be something where that'll change the pattern of the marks it leaves on a bullet.
And not to mention the fact that, bullets often strike other things after they leave the gun, right? I mean, there's all sorts of ways for these marks to get
marked up. Yeah.